Hello everyone, this is part 24 of What If Naruto Was a Prodigy and in the Anbu, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Small. Secondary explosions continued to rumble throughout the air as the attack squad fled the scene. The explosive tags detonated at the base of the support structure had been effective, and a large weapons factory had been successfully brought down. It was quite the blow to the loyalist forces of the 4th Mizukage, and another tally added to the Resistance's ever-growing list of victories. Yet, despite the stunning victory they had just wrought, Naruto couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The small group of allied resistance members and Black Ops Leaf Nin regrouped a couple of kilometers away from the factory, circling around the inlet and moving towards the center of the island. The jungle trees grew half as tall as the giant forests of the Land of Fire, their thick, green canopy shielding them from view. The air was warm and humid, almost unpleasantly, and insects buzzed noisily around them. Komaki was running her hands over the back of Yuka's blood-splattered head, a gentle green light glowing from between her fingers. She was earning her position as Team Sigma's medical officer, having already finished Naruto's fractured arm. The Resistance's medic Nin, ironically called Kiri, was crouched down over one of his team, running his own hands over the large gash in his leg. Mei looked quite pleased with herself. Unlike the rest of her squad, it didn't look like a speck of dirt had stained her gray flak jacket, and her long red hair swayed in the breeze. Naruto watched her very carefully. That was an excellent operation, she told Naruto with real warmth in her voice. She regarded him with sparkling green eyes. You and your team are quite skilled. That fire technique you used was very impressive. Says the woman who can spit lava, Naruto responded dryly. Mei laughed, throwing her head back. Quite ironic, she agreed. Naruto smiled thinly behind his mask. It did go well, he agreed. I'd say it went too well. Mei cocked her head in puzzlement as Naruto turned to fully face her. You didn't need us for that attack, the blonde Anbu captain continued, his voice hardening. You and your forces could have quite easily taken out that factory without us, so why did you want us to come along? Mei looked taken aback, but then a soft smile crossed her face. It was guarded by 2 of the 7 swordsmen of the mist, she answered. I took out one, and you took out the other. I wouldn't have wanted to face them alone. The swordsman I took out wasn't that good, Naruto shot back, shaking his head. I'm sure you have shinobi capable of that level of skill. He was good enough. Mei looked at him strangely. He was a brute, yes, but he was fast and vicious and very good with that sword. The new incarnation of the swordsmen may lack the sheer quality and skill of the previous generation, but they're not weaklings. Naruto wasn't convinced. You're either overestimating the number of shinobi the resistance has that are at your caliber, Mei said, or you're underestimating your own prowess. Yes, the resistance probably could have taken that factory without your help, but it would have cost us lives. With you, we didn't even lose a single fighter. Mei's face softened, and for a brief moment she looked quite sad as her voice turned wistful. It's not often that happens. It was a plausible explanation, and the display of emotion from Mei was almost touching. It was almost believable. Maybe Naruto was being a bit too hard on himself without that combination fire technique at the beginning of the fight, things could have gotten tough. If the swordsman hadn't been wounded, Naruto could see how dangerous and deadly he would have been with that weapon. Still, something didn't sit right with him. Komaki finished patching up Yuka, adjusting a gauze pad to her head and wrapping a bandage around the front of her mask where the Yamanaka's forehead would be. Kiri looked like he was done with his patient, the dour-looking teen rising and nodding shortly to Mei. And now we part, Mei said. She gestured around them. Loyalist reinforcements will arrive shortly, drawn out from nearby bases and outposts. She turned to Naruto, her face becoming serious. Remember the plan. We'll retreat south, making as much noise as we can. Use the maps, follow the plans, and work with the times. Naruto nodded shortly. He raised a hand, gesturing to the 3 other members of his squad. Rat emerged from the trees, pulling back from his sentry duty, while Yuka and Komaki joined him. Mei eyed Naruto one last time, and she smiled mischievously. Good luck, my favorite little blonde, she cooed, and, bending down, she planted a soft kiss to Naruto's exposed blonde locks. Naruto resisted the instinct to bury his knee in her stomach and just rolled his eyes behind his mask. Still, the beautiful woman's hair tickled the nape of his neck and her scent filled his nostrils. Truth be told, it wasn't entirely an unpleasant experience. Mei retreated and Naruto gave her a wordless nod. Then, he raised his hand and turned to his team. Scouting formation, avoid enemy contact, move due southeast, the second phase is now in effect. Without another word, Team Sigma disappeared in brief flickers of movement. As they ran through the large trees and towards the oceans, using the Resistance's knowledge of the Loyalist patrols to avoid any unnecessary conflict, Komaki cleared her throat. Got a new girlfriend, she noted blandly. Yuka made a noise in the back of her throat as Naruto shook his head. We're being used, he told them darkly. I don't know how, I don't know why, and I don't know what for, but something's going on and I don't like it. He eyed each member of his squad as they raced through the trees. Be on your guard, he warned them. And be prepared for anything. Uchiha Sasuke stood at the head of the captured freighter, the Atakebune, and watched as the mist around the vessel rolled around him. From behind his mask, his Sharingan spun lazily, idly noting the chakra entwined with it, fueling its appearance. Two of the resistance members had left a short time ago, and now the first of the refugees had begun to flock to the ship. They came in whatever they could: fishing boats, rafts, even a canoe. A rope ladder had been tossed over the side, and one by one the refugees climbed up. Those too old, infirm or unable to make it were gently carried up by a shinobi. Seeing no other activity around them, Sasuke turned his head and watched as Chukichi conversed quietly with one of the other shinobi. The other woman seemed agitated, but the larger, burly man said something and she quietened, although she still looked mulish. Nearby, Cage and another resistance member carried up a stack of wooden crates. We're ready, Kazuya called out from the other side of the ship. The dark-skinned, silver-haired noble was busy coordinating the stream of refugees coming in from the smaller boats that had flocked around the ship. Chukichi nodded stonily. He gave a couple of curt orders to one of his subordinates as they began the process of camouflaging the refugees. On the other side of the deck, a group of resistance members began to haul up the freighter's cargo: hundreds of barrels of whale blubber, meat and oil. One of the shinobi tipped the first barrel over, and Sasuke wrinkled his nose as a rather foul smell came from the pile of sloppy whale blubber. The loyalists at the Bloody Cove weren't going to let dozens of civilians just walk out of the port. Instead, they would have to be hidden. By removing the goods and installing fake bottoms, the refugees could hide within the barrels. The smaller compartment at the top would be filled with fresh whale products, fresh enough that the residual natural chakra should mask the hidden civilians from the loyalist senses. It was a rather quick process. They were on a schedule, after all. The 38 refugees, 39 if you included Kazuya, were loaded on board. Approximately 36 barrels were also brought up from the smaller boats surrounding the freighter. Each one had a false bottom on it, allowing a single refugee to crouch down in a barrel. Kiri waved glowing green hands over each refugee and passed them a small tonic to drink, and it only took a minute before each man, woman and child was sedated and in place. There was some difficulty with one of the refugees, however. A young, haggard-looking woman had brought a baby with her. She couldn't have been much older than Sasuke, and the young Uchiha had initially thought that perhaps the baby had been a sibling or a relative, but their facial structures were similar and the way she held the child protectively to her chest was just like his aunt had held his cousin when Sasuke had been a child. She was rather pretty with her pale skin and her waif-like eyes, and suddenly Sasuke didn't really want to know, consider just who might be the father. Nothing would surprise him in these blood-soaked lands. The mother had been adamant about not giving the baby anything, and Kiri was growing increasingly frustrated. In the end, she wasn't given a choice as Kiri swiped a hand over her eyes before she could react. The young medic looked a tad regretful as he did so, and was extra careful as he helped place her in her barrel, making sure that the child was safely secured. Sasuke noted this from his position at the head of the ship, his Sharingan spinning as he stood guard. The rest of the transfer would only take another 10 minutes or so. The false bottoms had been placed on the barrels and the resistance shinobi were currently placing fresh whale produce on top: blubber and oil and meat. The barrels would join the rest of the stock, another couple of hundred, and then they would head for the Bloody Cove. Phase 1 of Bravo Squad's mission was complete. For the most part, the journey from the weapons factory towards their next target was uneventful. It was almost relaxing for Naruto, that is. With his insanely huge chakra reserves and almost limitless stamina, he could have continued the run over the ocean waves all day. Unfortunately for the rest of the team, they didn't have the same advantages as the Jinchuriki, and as such they needed to rest. There was still phase 2 of the operation to finish, and Naruto didn't want to lead an exhausted, chakra-depleted squad into battle. As such, the small group of boats ahead of them were going to suit their purposes just fine. The flags they flew on their masts indicated that they were part of Kiri's scouting and patrol forces. There were 4 boats bobbing on the calm, blue surface. Without Daichi, it was impossible to be certain, but Yuka was a half-decent sensor on her own, and she had only counted a dozen shinobi manning the patrol. Yuka, provide long-range support with Komaki, flank from the right, Rat, go underneath, attack from below, I will engage the front, middle boat is priority target, do not damage, Naruto signed a few kilometers away from the patrol, S. Understood, the rest of the team signaled back. Naruto didn't bother with the pretense of stealth as he sprinted forward. He was a blur on the surface of the ocean as he rapidly approached the patrol. He took a deep breath, steadying himself and readying his chakra, while the rest of his squad trailed off behind him. Then, they split up, and Komaki and Yuka darted off to the right and Rat expertly slipped beneath the surface of the water. The Kirinin had spotted them and bells were ringing on the boats. People were shouting and a small line of shinobi stood on the deck of the first ship. They were still a couple of kilometers out, but Naruto picked out specks of movement coming towards him and easily avoided them. Dozens of bullets of tightly compressed water shot at him, missing him and exploded on the surface of the water. Loud booms and large splashes of water tore through the air around him, and Naruto was drenched from all sides. He was temporarily obscured from the view of the enemy and used it to make a set of hand seals. Chakra surged through him, and he folded it upon itself twice. Shadow clone technique. Half a dozen shadow clones burst into existence around him and they immediately jumped away, their hands flashing through hand seals. As they landed on the surface of the water, each clone reared his head back and spat out a series of fiery streaks back at the boats. The real Naruto continued his advance as he completed his second technique. Fire release. Great wave of flame. He reared his head back and spat out an enormous wave of blazing flame. The water around him hissed and spluttered as the writhing wave of flame rapidly advanced on the patrol. Water around the boats and Kirinin rose up in a gigantic wall, easily able to hold off a fire technique, and that was when Naruto's third technique came into effect. His hands were coated with wind elemental chakra, and he brandished them in front of him. He sliced the air, and unseen scythes of wind lashed out to where the wave of fire and the wall of water had met. They fueled the flames, giving the wave of flame a boost for a split second. Normally, the wind chakra would normally have been swallowed up within the flames, devoured to make the fire even stronger, but Naruto held the ram's seal and concentrated. He was already quite used to separating differing elemental chakra within his own body, and it wasn't that hard to extend it to his techniques. The scythes of wind burst through the fire unhindered and tore through the wall of water with contemptuous ease. Naruto caught a flash of a single Kirinin, one who was too close and too slow to dodge, lose an arm in a spray of blood, and then the boat was struck. It was a small boat, barely bigger than a fishing vessel, and the high-powered elemental technique ripped the wood apart with ease. Water spouted up from the bottom of the boat as the hull was pulverized in a showering spray of wooden splinters. 2 of the Kirinin on board had managed to escape, darting around the wreckage and onto the water, but the wounded one was too distracted to move, and he went down, torn apart by debris. Another boat on the other side of the patrol rocked from side to side as they were peppered with small explosions. Yuka and Komaki kept the distance as they pelted the small vessel with exploding tags. Fire raged from the engine and oil began to splutter on the surface of the water. As the Kirinin began to regroup on the water, there was a flash of movement and then wire shot up from beneath the surface. It wrapped itself around the man, twisting and contorting him into positions that the human body was not meant to handle, and then Rat surfaced, and killed him in a single, efficient stab to the throat. Blood spilled on the water as Rat dropped the corpse and moved to engage the third of the survivors, leaving Naruto to begin his assault on the other vessels. 2 of the 4 boats were driftwood and 5 of the Kirinin were dead in the first 10 seconds of combat, but the rest of them were beginning to regroup and counterattack. Naruto slapped his hands together and focused on a nearby piece of wood as a spiraling drill of water rose up from the surface, using the replacement technique to avoid a blow that would have taken out his torso. He reappeared on the remains of the first boat as woman with a buzz cut and wearing a Jonin vest moved to engage him. She carried a single-edged sword and swiped at his head with surprising speed. Naruto blocked the blow with his forearm guards, and metal scraped against metal as he parried the blow to the side. At the same time, he launched a kick at the woman's knee, but she blocked it with her shin and used to leverage to push him back. Her hand came up to lash out at his face, and as Naruto dodged to the side, he had to pull of an uncomfortable acrobatic maneuver to avoid the tip of her blade that lashed out at his throat. They fought in furious close combat as the battle continued on around them. The woman was taller than him and about just as fast. She was clearly skilled with the blade and used an unusual taijutsu style in conjunction with it to launch attacks from unexpected angles. She was fast enough to avoid his counterattacks and stop him from making hand seals, and she seemed to have picked up on the fact that Naruto was the ninjutsu specialist on the squad because she continued to press her advantage. In the few seconds of combat they had had with one another, Naruto had already determined that the sword was the most pressing issue to deal with. Fists clenched, Naruto jumped back, retreating to get some room. Then, as the enemy Jonin chased, he spun around to kick at the surface of the water. The chakra left his foot in an intense pulse and a small wave shot up at the woman. At the same time, Naruto halted his advanced and unexpectedly attack with a single punch. The Jonin broke through the water with ease, slicing down through it to meet Naruto's hands, and then the metal of the blade struck against a glowing, spiraling ball in his hand. The Rasengan ground against the sword for a single instant. Then, it shattered, and Naruto's attack continued. The woman's eyes widened as she leant backwards to avoid the thrust to her chest while simultaneously kicking up at him. Naruto let out a grunt as her foot knocked his hand aside, the Rasengan dispersing as it tore through the first few layers of her flak vest. The woman darted backwards, forming hand seals, as Naruto did the same. Water release. Black rain technique. A black mist rose up from the ocean, pungent and slick. At the same time, a column of spirally water shot out of the ocean with a deafening roar. The fully formed water dragon was 10 times the size of Naruto and shot out towards him with terrifying speeds. At the same time, the black mist had spread over a sizable portion of the ocean. Naruto tossed a single kunai towards the dragon, and then, taking a deep breath, let the chakra underneath his feet fade. He dropped instantly into the ocean, twisting to face the surface with a single hand seal formed. Detonate. The exploding tag was a mere Class E, more of a pop than a bang, but it was the spark the flammable black mist needed. It caught alight and a huge billowing cloud of flame lit up the surface of the ocean in front of him. A deep roar boomed around him, muffled by the water, as the surface caught alight and began to rage. The water dragon exploded underneath the sudden intense heat, unable to keep its structure as its user dropped into the ocean to join Naruto. The young blonde could see her sporting a few burns, but she was otherwise unharmed. He felt a pang of annoyance shoot through him. This was taking too long. Then, suddenly, the woman was expertly gliding through the water towards him, her hands flashing in seals, and Naruto belatedly realized that forcing a Kiri-nin underwater might not have been the best idea. Shimmering contortions formed around her fingertips as 5 large, fierce-looking sharks made up of writhing water formed in front of her. Naruto focused on the chakra surging in his body and layered it upon his tenketsu. What he did next was more of a chakra training exercise than an actual technique as he flooded the water all around him with his water elemental chakra. It surged and spluttered underneath the force of his chakra even as the sharks glided towards him, razor-sharp teeth somehow gleaming beneath the fiery surface of the ocean. Fire release. Soaring flame bullets. Naruto reared his head back and expertly shot out 6 streaks of fire. Normally, such a technique underwater would have been useless, but Naruto had made the water around him his, and he simply separated the 2 different types of elemental chakra and allowed the fire to pass. 5 of the bullets struck the water sharks and they exploded in billowing clouds of superheated steam. The 6th bullet shot out at the Jonin and exploded a meter in front of her as it came into contact with water outside of Naruto's influence. While the flame had disappeared, the momentum that had propelled it had not, and a scalding streak of boiling water was pushed right into the face of the enemy. Naruto saw her mouth open in a soundless scream as her skin reddened and blistered underneath the force of his extinguished fire technique. Her eyes blackened and bubbles exploded from her mouth as she clutched at her throat. She began to sink as she thrashed around helplessly in the water. Naruto watched her disappear into the darkened depths, his cheeks bulged with the single breath of air he had taken before. Satisfied that the Jonin would not be recovering, and particularly a way that was one of the nastier ways he had ever killed somebody, Naruto broke up to the surface and finished the fight. There wasn't much to finish. The Jonin had been the only troubling opponent and the rest of his team had mopped up the patrol quite easily. A few minutes later, the four Anbu put the engine of the sole remaining boat on full power and settled down for a break. They had one last thing to do. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, the Atakebune arrived at the Bloody Cove. It was one of 3 moderately sized freighters that were at port at the fortress-like town. Sasuke stood, disguised as a Kirinin with bandages wrapped around his face, and he watched the freighter tie itself down to the large dock. Despite being the trading hub between the land of fire and the land of water, there wasn't much activity going on. That wasn't necessarily a good thing, since that meant that anything they did was going to stand out even more. The Bloody Cove had been built around the cove where it had received its name. 5 large piers stretched out towards the water, each one able to take 5 vessels of the Atakebune's size. Stacks of shipping containers rose up on one side, rusty metal gleaming in the sunlight. Beyond the docks was a large road that led out to a set of at least 3 different walls and gates. Houses of dull, grey stone had been built around each of the roads, looking more like barracks and guard houses than people's homes. The air smelt of salt and fish, and despite the fact that the place resembled more of a military outpost and less of a village, Sasuke could see signs of civilian habitation clothes pegged out on lines, fishing boats dotting the beach, a gaggle of people doing the sorts of odds and ends that shinobi wouldn't. It was a pretty miserable place, and one that looked like it was completely under the thumb of Kiri's military forces. Sasuke felt a twinge of anxiety that he ruthlessly squashed a second later. He kept close to Kage, who had disguised himself as a Kiri Jonin leader. Daichi, Toa and Sasuke were the Chunin underneath Kage who had been assigned to guard the freighter on its journey to the Bloody Cove. 4 other members of the resistance had taken the role of a second squad, while their leader, Chukichi, had taken a handful of his squad and slipped away before the ship had come into port. As a leading member of the resistance, Chukichi was the 3rd most wanted shinobi in the land of water at the moment, and the risk that he might be recognized despite any disguise was simply too great. Chukichi was going to rendezvous with Terumi Mei's squad and assist in the second wave of attacks. Hopefully, with Naruto attacking in the north and the resistance attacking in the south, they would be able to draw away a lot of Kirigaku's Anbu and Hunter Nin from the town. Kage led his squad to the small group off the boat and towards the small group of waiting Kirinin at the entrance of the docks. The head of the group was a tired-looking man wearing a pair of half-moon glasses. Despite his lackluster appearance, his headband had been recently polished and it gleamed brightly in the sun. He was flanked by 2 imposing blank-masked shinobi. "Sir." Kage bowed his head, his tone perfectly flat. "Jonin Sumaki reporting in. I have with me Chunin Adate, Zumaro and Wata. We're under a B-rank mission to escort the Atakebune to the Bloody Cove." The man consulted his clipboard, rifling through the papers. He nodded, making a humming noise in the back of his throat. "Yes, we've received your paperwork, Jonin," he said. "Where are the rest of your team?" Kage gestured back at the ship, where barrels were being rolled off of the deck by the other undercover shinobi. "Preparing the goods for inspection, sir," he answered obediently. "Good, good." The inspector exhaled nosily and raked a hand through his hair. "Let's go have a look, shall we?" Kage fell into step with the man and the 2 tied operatives, and Sasuke drifted behind them. The sensation of nervousness threatened to upset his equilibrium, and he had to make sure that he wasn't giving anything away. It was a tense situation for him, knowing that he was in the heart of the enemy's stronghold. Plus, he was certain that he was being watched, that they all were by hidden observers. The hair on the back of his neck prickled as the unseen observers stared at them. "What goods are you declaring here?" the inspector asked Kage in a well-rehearsed tone. Sasuke was sure that the man had the information already, but Kage answered with well-practiced ease. "Whale products," he replied easily. "Oil, blubber and meat. 200 barrels. The inspector frowned. "A small cargo," he noted. "I'm no fisherman, but apparently the migration cycle of the whales have started later than usual this year," Kage answered with a small shrug. The inspector hummed as they came up next to the Atakebune. Dozens of barrels had already been wheeled out and the resistance team was waiting by them. The inspector gestured to one of the Tide operatives by his side, and the Anbu walked over and pried off the lid of the nearest barrel. A foul stench rose up into the air as the operative peered into it. Sasuke kept the emotion off of his face, but he could have sworn his heart stopped for a moment. The other Tide operative had brought his hands together in a seal, and he had sunken onto the spot, concentrating. As one of the operatives opened each barrel and inspected its contents, the other a sensor, Sasuke hazarded a guess scanned its contents. 2 members of the resistance team kept rolling the barrels down while the other 2 began to roll the inspected barrels aside to make room. Given that you only have a small cargo, we should be able to get this done in a few hours, the inspector noted thoughtfully. He was ticking things off of his clipboard as the 2 Tide operatives continued their inspections. We'll weigh them next, and then get the dogs to have a search, empty a couple, he shrugged. You know the drill. If it came to that, then there was no way the deception was going to work, Sasuke thought grimly. Any truly significant inspection of the barrels was going to reveal the hidden occupants one way or another, and there was no way that they could fight their way out of the city, at least, not without Naruto here with them. The diversions that Alpha Squad and the Resistance were causing were meant to have started 10 or 15 minutes ago. News would be trickling back to the bloody cove, and soon. A pair of chiming bells began to ring. The inspector's head shot up, his posture suddenly alert, while the 2 Tide operatives straightened. A second set of bells rang, and then a third, and there was a sudden hub of activity around them as the Kirinin were roused. The inspector frowned as the Tide operatives paused in their search. It looks like you're going to be delayed, he said grimly. It looks like something's come up, so you'll have to stay put until further notice. Without warning, the 2 Tide operatives suddenly disappeared in single flicker of movement. Sasuke turned to watch a squad of black-robed, blank-masked shinobi form up further on the dock for a brief moment before they all departed to the south. As soon as they were gone, the inspector turned back to them. Honey sings in the summer rain, he whispered urgently. A sweet song of sorrow, Cage responded quietly. The inspector let out a breath. Right, he said quickly. The 2 Anbu here were on the assault team. They'll be leaving shortly. When they do, we'll bring the carts up. You'll load the barrels onto 6 carts and move out to the city walls. Take this. He ripped a piece of paper off of his clipboard and handed it to Cage. That'll get you through the first 2 checkpoints, said the inspector, obviously a resistance supporter. On the third one, a man with a green earring will approach you. Say that Megumi has given the all clear, and you'll be let through. Sasuke exhaled softly, and Toa clapped him briefly on the back. So far, it looked like everything was going according to plan. On the main continent of the elemental countries, in the north of the territory that Kirigakure had wrested from Konoha during the previous Great Wars, was a small observation and communications outpost. Apparently built to monitor the coastline between it and the Land of Waves, the outpost consisted of a tall lighthouse built on the top of a cliff, surrounded by a series of buildings and a wall. Inside were at least 24 shinobi, a mixture of a scouting force to monitor the border, a response force to counter any incursions, and according to resistance intel at least 2 Tide operatives at any particular time. They were well trained and well equipped to deal with an assault on from either the Land of Waves or the Land of Fire. However, the shinobi on duty there were not expecting an attack from their own borders. A small patrol boat, engine revved on max speed, surged through the water towards the cliff face. Whatever shinobi that should have been on watch duty was not there to raise the alarm, and the boat struck the pier with incredible force. A second later, the 24 explosive tags detonated, ripping the pier and a large portion of the coastal defenses to shreds in a single instant. A huge fireball blossomed up into the air as a thunderous boom echoed in the air. Wooden debris and twisted metal rained from the skies all over the outpost. 4 blurs darted forward in the wake of the explosions. The figure in lead formed a series of hand seals and a suffocating presence fell down on the area around him. Fire formed in his mouth and he shot out a searing, white-hot column of tightly compressed flame. It shot out with incredible force, lancing upwards towards the lighthouse, and the top of the spiraling building disappeared underneath the force of the incredible attack. More explosions and fire rained down upon the buildings of the outpost as it was peppered with explosions as the squad moved in towards their objective. It was a furious onslaught that would have given even the most experienced shinobi pause, but not this much pause. It was 30 seconds into their attack that Naruto realized that something was wrong. He held up a hand and the squad paused at the beach. Fire raged all around them, huge plumes of black smoke rising all around them as wood crackled in the background. Twisted and charred debris bobbed up and down on the surface of the water as Naruto surveyed the area around them carefully. Location of enemy personnel, he signaled. Yuka made a series of hand seals. No shinobi detected. Naruto frowned behind his mask. There should have been at least 20 enemy shinobi waiting for them, and any good shinobi would have left the buildings in an instant and taken to the water where things were much harder to burn. But, even as the fires continued to rage around them, building up into a huge blaze that would be difficult to put out without a water technique, nobody came out to oppose them. The outpost was deserted. That was troubling for two reasons. Firstly, without an enemy presence here, nobody would report to the Bloody Cove that they were under attack and Naruto and his squad would be unable to draw forces away from the cage and the packages. Secondly, a lack of enemy presence implied one of two things. Either the intel on the outpost was incorrect and it had been deserted, or contact. Northeast, southwest, west, east, were surrounded, Yuka signed furiously. Naruto gritted his teeth and clenched his fists. Or the enemy had known they were coming and this was a trap. The blonde Anbu captain made a series of hand seals and the squad formed up in a defensive formation. Black-clad, blank mask-tied operatives had surrounded them from all sides. The outpost was suddenly full of a dozen members of Kiri's Anbu forces. Behind them, standing motionless on the surface of the ocean, stood another handful of shinobi. They held back, waiting, as Naruto assessed his options. The fires around them were already raging quite well. With a few well-placed techniques, Naruto could attempt to open a path for his squad to retreat to the north towards the border of the Land of Waves. He would provide long-range ninjutsu support to hamper the enemy's pursuit, hopefully buying time for his team to escape. It wasn't looking good, Naruto decided grimly. He swallowed, chakra surging in his body, his fingers clenched tightly in the palms of his gloves, every muscle in his body poised for sudden movement. Depending on the caliber of the opponent, it was possible that they wouldn't be able to escape. Rat. Komaki. Yuka. Naruto felt a swell of determination well up within him, as well as a dark surge of power as the sound of rusting chains clanked in his ears. If it came down to it, he would use the power of the nine-tailed demon fox if he had to. Contact, approaching figure, 7 o'clock, Komaki signed, her entire body tense and alert. Somebody was approaching them from the fiery remains of the outpost, seemingly unbothered from the heat surrounding them. An unsettling cloud of chakra surrounded them, shielding them, and for a moment Naruto could have sworn that the third Hokage was there, for whom else could have a chakra presence that dense and powerful. Then, the figure walked out of the fire and Naruto jerked back as if struck. The man, although he almost looked as if he was still a child, came to a halt. He wore a grey piece of armor over a green robe, the latter which was wrapped around his neck, his headband had been wrapped around his waist, and grey trousers were tucked into shin-high brown boots. A long staff rested on his back, a curved, sharp hook on either end, and a curious flower had been stuck on the top. He had a stitched scar running from the bottom of his left eye to his jawline, and pale, almost pink, eyes stared dully at him from underneath a mop of short, brown hair. The look on his face was one of dull apathy, as if the presence of an enemy wasn't even enough to get worked up about. The trembling chakra presence that surrounded him, shielding him from the flames, was enough to send ripping waves through the puddles of water around them, and Naruto could feel the heavy weight of the power rest on his shoulders. There was something underneath it, too, something dark and ferocious that Naruto had known all his life. He knew what it was. It was the same type of burden that he had lived with all his life. He was an S-rank shinobi. A legitimate cage of one of the 5 great powers. A Jinchuriki. And he had 20 of his loyal, elite Anbu with him. Yagura, the 4th Mizukage of the village hidden in mist, stared at the 4 members of Alpha Squad, surveying each one very carefully. When he spoke, his voice was toneless. Why are you in my lands attacking my soldiers, Leaf Nin? The fires around them continued to rage, sending out plumes of greasy smoke into the air. Wood crackled and a loud pop echoed throughout the devastated outpost as a supporting wall of a small building collapsed, caving in the roof. Above them, high on the cliff, the lighthouse also burned, sending down glowing red-hot bits of debris. Naruto stood on the shore of the base with Yuka, Komaki and Rat behind him, observing the surroundings grimly. The 4th Mizukage, Yagura, stood before him. His childlike face was expressionless and he regarded the destruction of one of his military outposts apathetically. All around him, and the burning buildings, stood his elite guard, the imposing blank-masked Anbu. Naruto and his small team were surrounded on all sides by a more powerful, larger force. Team Sigma had been through a lot over the past year, but things had never quite been this bad. I asked you a question, Yagura said tonelessly. His voice and demeanor were quite frankly dull. There was no expression in either his tone or face, and he merely stood there with his arms folded. It was almost like he was speaking to a child. Why are you here? The more time Yagura spent talking to them, the more time Naruto had to think about his options. He licked his lips behind his mask and took a step forward. The intense pressure of the other man's chakra continued to fall upon him, but Naruto had served the third Hokage for years, and the sensation was not unfamiliar. He considered his responses as Yagura's attention was drawn to him. Orders, he answered quietly. Yagura's brow furrowed and a slightly pensive look came over his face. Has your village declared war on mine? He questioned them. If so, I have not been informed. No war, Naruto replied as shortly and succinctly as he could. His eyes flickered over the burning buildings, counting the number of Tide operatives he could see and searching for the ones he couldn't. Just a mission. Unacceptable, Yagura stated firmly. You will surrender into my custody immediately. Failure to comply will result in your deaths. Naruto didn't doubt that. Why are you here? Naruto asked instead, intent on buying as much time as he could. His fists clenched and he exhaled noisily. You shouldn't be anywhere near the mainland. The resistance, despite their annoyance, can be a useful source of information, Yagura informed him emotionlessly. Something glittered behind his eyes. Your presence in my lands has not gone unnoticed, Leaf Nin. Naruto held himself rigidly, feeling a familiar well of frustration and dread rise upon from within. They'd been sold out. Yagura took a step forward and the pressure that had settled around him intensified. This will be your last chance. Surrender peacefully. Your lives still may be spared. Spared so that they might be bartering chips used against Konoha. Spared for interrogation and torture. Spared so they might find themselves in the brutal grip of the bloody mist. Naruto folded the chakra in on himself 4 times and expelled it from his tenketsu in a single, continuous wave. The air around them crackled and popped as Naruto's potent chakra forced Yagura's away, and the ground and water around them shuddered and rippled under the strain of hosting such powerful energies. Yagura blinked, and for a moment Naruto thought he looked slightly surprised. He took another step forward. You know we won't surrender, he retorted firmly. He gestured at the 4th Mizukage with one hand, while he brought his other hand behind his back. Why don't you let me make that offer to you? Walk away, Yagura, and you might just live. Yagura stared back, seemingly unimpressed. At the same time, Naruto wiggled his fingers behind him, using a short-handed variant of the Anbu hand code. Retreat southwest towards wall, I will hold them off, wait for signal. But before Naruto could do anything more, movement flickered into existence in front of him and a single Tide operative was kneeling before the 4th Mizukage. Yagura cocked his head and regarded his loyal soldier. Report. My lord, a small merchant caravan has left the Bloody Cove and is making its way to the wall, the woman said. It took a moment for Naruto to recognize her as the woman who his squad had encountered on their first trip to the wall, the one who had cut down the refugees fleeing towards them. Yagura took the news with a slight nod. Take squads 1, 2 and 5 with you, he ordered. And find them. At the very least, they have disobeyed emergency protocol. He turned to assess Naruto carefully. Then, he said, once you have found them, kill them all. The woman nodded and made a series of unfamiliar gestures. Almost immediately, about 10 of the black-robed operatives surrounding them disappeared from sight. Naruto could only hope that the rest of Team Sigma was able to reach the wall in time. Now then, Yagura began, but Naruto wasn't paying any attention. The sudden departure of Shinobi had opened a path, if only briefly, and given Naruto a chance to act. In the split second before the rest of the formation moved to fill the gaps of the departed comrades, Naruto let the chakra that he was pumping into the surroundings grow. A sudden intense pulse of chakra shot through the air as Naruto brought his hands together. Fire release. Great fireball technique. Fire release. Great wave of flame. Fire release. Blazing river. Fire release. Soaring flame bullets. Fire release. Fire dragon bullet technique. Naruto had never stacked so many techniques simultaneously, and he had never done so with just himself and without any clones to assist. Nonetheless, he had several things going for him. Firstly, his chakra was all around him, spread through the ground and the rubble and the fires that raged around the outpost. That put less of a strain on his body. Secondly, all of the techniques were of the same elemental type, which made the formation of the chakra within his body much easier. Thirdly, his teammates were in danger. It had to work. Yagura reared back as the fires around him suddenly raged with a sudden increasing potency. Plumes of flame rose up into the air and a gigantic wave 5 times the height of the Mizukage swept towards him. Air popped and a terrible boom roared over the village as dozens of streaks of searing balls of flame shot out in all directions. The ground glowed and turned red hot, glowing rocks, mud and dirt setting everything they touch alight. One of the remaining buildings of the outpost simply disappeared as a ball of flame enveloped it, sending a rain of wooden and metal shards down on everything around it. And then a thin, tightly condensed stream of fire so hot and bright that it hurt to look at rose into the air. It lanced forward and tore through the concrete spire of the lighthouse with contemptuous ease. Bits of rubble and debris fell to the ground as the technique sheared the lighthouse in two, and suddenly there was tons of rock falling down upon the outpost as the top half of the lighthouse was separated from its base. Go! Naruto roared, not even looking back. His tenketsu burned from the strain of releasing so many techniques and he grimaced as he molded the chakra for another technique. The fires raged unabated, a conflagration of immense proportions as the rubble from the lighthouse struck the water behind them. The ground shuddered and a huge wave of water exploded outwards from the collapse. Within that, a squad of 3 shinobi darted forward and moved to engage the Anbu operatives standing on the surface of the ocean. Another squad moved to the north, peppering the operatives with kunai, while a third and fourth squad moved west and south. Amidst all of these shadow clones, the real Alpha team darted between the rising smoke and rubble and sprinted at top speed towards the southwest, toward the wall and an army of friendly shinobi to save them. Naruto didn't. Their enemy was a cage, and they would never be able to escape an S-rank shinobi so easily. Instead, he clasped his hands together and concentrated. He has been ordered by the Hokage to survive, even if it meant blowing his cover. Besides, Yagura seemed to know exactly where they had come from anyway. A wave of chakra washed over the outpost and water rose from the oceans to sweep the fire away. Huge clouds of hissing steam and plumes of smoke obscured the area, but Yagura's unconcerned form was still plainly visible. Naruto reached down within him and drew on the power of the 9-tailed demon fox. He ignored the sudden fatigue and darkness that tried to overtake his mind as the feelings of anger and rage and sorrow and so much crushing guilt that he had repressed came rising up with the power. The sound of rattling chains filled his ears as the mental representation of his emotional issues drank greedily from the foul power of the demon within him. Something chuckled darkly in his ear. It wasn't the 9-tailed fox but something else. As all of that was happening, a crimson miasma of power exploded around his form. The potent, dark chakra formed a visage of a large, sneering fox, and a terrible ear-splitting howl rose up into the air. Naruto panted and gasped as he rested the power where he wanted it with practiced ease. His teeth were sharpening, his fingers popping out of their sockets as they extended and formed claws. He could feel his lips stretching and his vision grew darker, but at the same time everything was more pronounced. 2 tails made up on crimson chakra swished behind him as Naruto pressed down on the ground and launched himself at the 4th Mizukage with everything he had. Emerging through the smoke and steam, Naruto caught a single glimpse of the first true emotion the Mizukage had displayed: shock. Then his fist, wreathed in crimson fire, lashed up to take the man's head from his shoulders. The Mizukage, despite his surprise, reacted smoothly as he reached for the long, hooked staff from his back and swung it at Naruto's face. It was a counterattack done in less than a second, and the cool metal of the back of the staff struck him in the cheek with incredible force. The miasma of chakra around him dampened the blow, but the force behind it was enough to send Naruto skidding sideways and he batted aside. He skidded along the ground and slammed into the fiery remains of a building by the pier. The building collapsed as Naruto tore through the walls and disappeared into the fire. A roar filled the air as Naruto emerged from the building a second later. His cheek had been split open and blood dribbled down onto the ground, curdling, blackening and disappearing as the potent chakra around him boiled it. His jawbone was visible, but even as he stood there, the skin began to kit itself back together. Naruto was panting as he glared at the Mizukage. Directing and controlling the chakra of the nine-tailed demon fox were two different things. You couldn't really control it as such. It reacted on instinct and impulse. Naruto would have a problem and the chakra would seek to resolve that problem in a variety of different ways. These flashes of insight were incredibly difficult to predict or plan, and instead came to Naruto as he needed to do it. As such, all he had to do was direct the chakra to a specific goal and unleash the power on it. The goal here, kill the fourth Mizukage, Yagura. The chakra bubbled and boiled around him as Naruto launched himself at Yagura again. Yagura slid into a two-handed stance and the staff flashed as it lashed out at Naruto. The young Jinchuriki dodged and lashed out with a strike of his clawed hand, which was blocked by the back end of the staff. The claws ran down the metal staff and sparks flew through the air as he gouged a single scratch into it. Amidst the ruins of the outpost and the battle between shadow clones and Tide operatives, Uzumaki Naruto engaged in combat with one of the 5 Kage of the hidden villages. Bravo team had left the Bloody Cove right on time, ushered through the gates with expediency as whatever people Terumi May had put into place played their roles perfectly. They were given another cursory inspection, but then quietly let through. Squads of loyal Kiri-nin sped towards the south, and Sasuke could see smoke rising up into the air as the resistance nin began their attack. Naruto was somewhere in the north, raising another. Between the dual attacks, plus trouble on the archipelago, the Kiri-nin would hopefully be too occupied to notice that a caravan had left and never returned. There were 6 wagons, each pulled by a horse, and they lumbered on the rocky, flat road. The trees and foliage around them was all dead, the ground salted and the plants destroyed so that nobody would be able to sneak up on them. It was an effective measure considering they were bordering the land of fire, where Leaf Nin were quite adept at using the vast forests there to camouflage their movements. It also meant that Bravo team had an unhindered view of the surroundings. Sasuke stood to the left of one of the wagons, his Sharingan spinning on at random intervals as he kept his eyes peeled for pursuers. Kage took the lead with the Resistance Nin team leader, a woman with large black bangs covering her eyes. Daichi stood on top of the middle wagon, doing the same thing as Sasuke with his Byakugan. Even though he appreciated his eyes, Sasuke couldn't help but feel that the Byakugan was infinitely more useful on missions such as these. He suddenly shivered. There was a chill in the air, and it was making the hair on the back of his neck stand up on end. Despite the warm sun beaming down on him, Sasuke could feel his limbs shaking. He eyed his arm, blinking in languid fascination as it shivered uncontrollably, and he was barely aware that he had stopped moving. The whole caravan had. The shinobi there stared to the northeast, and Sasuke raised his eyes to gaze at the far horizon as well. In the distance, plumes of smoke were rising up into the sky. The wind howled around them, but the breeze was soft on his skin. Then, Sasuke activated the Sharingan. It was as if a blanket of cold terror had been swept off of him. There was a horrible, foul power radiating throughout the air. Shit, Kage muttered. He turned to his resistance counterpart. That's a problem, he told her grimly. Is that, she began. Contact. Daichi interrupted loudly. Northeast approaching rapidly and fanning out to surround us. Kiri Anbu. Sasuke stiffened in alarm and he whirled around. There was nothing he could see at the moment, but he trusted his teammates' eyes. There was a fluster of movement at the front as the resistance team leader jumped up to where Daichi was standing. How many? She demanded hoarsely. I count 11, Daichi replied evenly. 4 squads of 2 and a squad of 3. The resistance nin whirled around. Kiri, Junko, Shiro. Form up. She turned to Kage, who had joined her. We'll go out and meet them, she told him quickly. You get the refugees to the wall. Understood. Kage gave her a brief nod. He turned to the wagons as the resistance team sped off to intercept their pursuers. They had been loaded so that only the second one carried all of the barrels that the refugees had hidden in. Several of the refugees played the parts of merchants and many of them had paled, looking fearful and frightened. We're going to split the wagons up, Kage ordered. Secure the reins and then whip the horses into running at top speed. You'll join our wagon and hopefully the ruse will buy us some time. Go. The civilians burst into movement as they jostled around the wagons, setting things up. A few moments later, 5 of the 6 wagons shot out away from them as the horses galloped forward at top speeds. One went down the road they were on as Kage led the wagon over the rocky ground, but still in the direction of the wall. Fall in, move out. Kage ordered and the wagon began to move quickly. They ran for at least 5 minutes. Behind them, a series of small pops burst into existence, explosions and the sounds of fighting beginning to rise in the air. A heavy mist was settling down on the area as the resistance team fought against superior numbers to hold them back. The enemy has been stalled, but several have moved around the resistance nin and are still pursuing us. Daichi called out as he monitored the situation with his Byakugan. They're splitting up to check the other wagons, but it won't take long to catch up, and 2 of them are heading our way. Toa, come with me. Daichi, you're in charge. Keep moving towards the wall. Kage ordered briskly. The older Anbu left with Toa following behind him as Daichi and Sasuke urged the wagon onwards as fast as they could. In the first 15 seconds of combat, Naruto and Yagura had exchanged over 50 blows. Naruto had manifested the power of the 9-tailed demon fox, but he was being slowly overwhelmed by the Mizukage's offense. The other man was barely as tall as Naruto was, but he wielded his staff expertly, possibly even better than anything Naruto had ever seen Sarutobi do. His crimson miasma clashed on the metal again and again as Naruto whirled around the enemy, hands, feet and tails lashing out at every angle. Yagura blocked, ducked and sidestepped, countered and moved in, only for Naruto to retreat, pause and advance once more in a never-ending cycle of attack and counterattack. Stray memories began to filter in as the Tide operatives quickly overwhelmed his shadow clones, and Naruto pressed the attack furiously. Yagura blocked with his staff, a dull metal clang echoing amidst all of the crackling fires and continuing secondary explosions, and then he brought the staff down to bash Naruto in the head. Naruto avoided the blow, but the staff turned and the hook at the front end caught him by the edge of his body armor. He was yanked forward and it was only his reflexes that saved his skull from being caved in as Yagura unleashed a devastating blow with the other end of his staff. Naruto felt a growl in the back of his throat, but his mind bombarded with negative emotions and the constant, maddening sound of rattling chains was relatively clear. He had practiced and trained this form with Jiraiya, and he knew the limits of his control and direction. His 2 tails extended and his lashed out at Yagura, who jumped back. A second later, the tails extended around 2 burning stumps of wood far larger and heavier than anything he could have carried by himself and they hurled the rubble at Yagura with ease. Yagura blocked one with his staff, but the impact sent him skidding back on the sand. The other one soared over his head and crashed into a building behind him, shattering brick, wood and glass. He gave Naruto a measuring look as the Jinchuriki began to hurl more and more stuff at him. How unnecessary, the Mizukage scoffed. He brandished his staff and water formed in front of him, a large, flat circular pool coming at the end of his staff. It formed a reflective mirror of water which hooked onto the end of his staff. Naruto hurled another piece of debris at him, a chunk of blackened concrete, and then another, a piece of burning wood. Yagura stood where he was and something flashed from his mirror, shooting forward and destroying both pieces of debris. Water splashed to the ground where the objects had collided. The same thing happened for the next half a dozen pieces of rubble that Naruto hurled at him. The Anbu captain felt the chakra rumbling in the back of his throat, expressing his dissatisfaction even as Naruto did his best to analyze the scene. His Jinchuriki form didn't have many long-ranged options, but he had already experienced how the other Jinchuriki was stronger and faster than he was. He wasn't going to be able to beat Yagura in close combat, especially while he had a much longer range than him courtesy of his staff. He also didn't want to get into a ninjutsu match with the cage of the village hidden in mist while he was standing right next to a body of water. Naruto felt heat burning at the back of his throat and he focused the chakra of the 9-tailed demon fox. Fire spilled from his lips and mouth as Naruto reared his head back and spat out a single streak of condensed demonic chakra. It surged forward, but was countered by the mirror as something shot out to intercept it. Naruto grinned, a somewhat manic look, focused the chakra in his throat and then spouted more and more streaks of fire. 1 became a dozen, became 100, became 1,000, a constant, unceasing barrage of fire that peppered Yagura without pause. The mirror shimmered as it counted each streak with a watery reflection, and fire and water met in a spectacular hiss of boiling water and scalding air. A steamy haze began to rise and the humidity went up, obscuring the distance between the 2 Jinchuriki even as Naruto continued to spray fiery streaks of dense chakra at Yagura. Then, as the steam rose and hid all from view, it abruptly stopped. Yagura paused for a moment, waiting, and then walked calmly out of the steam. His elite Anbu joined him, kneeling down in a semicircle around him. Go and get him, he ordered. Yes, Mizukage-sama. They intoned and disappeared in a flicker of movement. Naruto was panting as he fed the chakra of the nine-tailed demon fox into his limbs, pushing them past their limits as he sprinted past the burning wreckage of the outpost and out towards the desolate forests with the twisted, dead trees. He was heading in the opposite direction of the wall, further away from his team to give them as much time to escape as possible. His mind raced as he bounded past rocks and fallen logs. He would keep them occupied for 5 more minutes, and then he was going to turn and flee right into the land of fire. His identity would have undoubtedly been compromised and Yagura would connect the dots. What happened afterwards would be something to worry about after his escape. He turned to gaze behind him, crimson eyes narrowed as he spotted the pursuit of the Tide operatives. He spat out more fire and it licked against the dead bark and branches of the forest around him, and within seconds a wildfire burned uncontrollably all around him. 2 black figures darted past the flames to approach him, but Naruto turned and used his 2 tails to push him forwards, avoiding their tightly compressed water bullets. They smacked on the ground, leaving visible dents. A second later, a dome of water rose above and around Naruto, trying to entrap him, but he broke free with little effort. He gathered his chakra and roared, a loud, bestial sound, and the very force of his voice pushed everything within a 5-meter radius away from him. Smoke tickled his sensitive nose, but the rest of Naruto's body was burning and it mattered little to him. He approached the nearest Tide operative and swiped his hand, ready to take off his head. The man was faster, or he had great reflexes, because he dodged the swipe and delivered a devastating kick to Naruto's stomach. Naruto gasped, eyes bulging, but recovered almost instantly and roared at the man. The force of his voice pushed him back and he went tumbling and skidding over the ground, disappearing into the wildfires that surrounded him. The chains rattled noisily in his ears, and Naruto growled in annoyance. Then, a second later, the second Tide operative darted towards him. Glowing yellow chakra lit up her fingertips and something had been written on his hand. Naruto jumped up and avoided the palm thrust, using his tail on a nearby tree to swing away. He saw the woman miss, her palm striking a rock, and glowing yellow fuinjutsu wrapped around the rock like chains. Suddenly, darkness blotted out the forest. Naruto looked up and saw a huge wave of water rising up to block out the sun. It was an immense tidal wave as tall as the Hokage's tower, and it came crashing down with the force of 1,000 explosive tags. The sound of roaring water blocked out anything else as it swept aside burning trees, rocks, logs and anything unfortunate to be in its path. Naruto barely had a chance to cross his arms over his chest before the water was upon him, striking him harder than any punch, pushing him off his feet and pulling him along the current. The crimson miasma surrounding him hissed and spluttered as the water boiled as it came into contact with it, but there was more to come. The young Jinchuriki was pushed along the tidal wave, his back crashing into whatever was in his path. His lungs burned with the need for air as he struggled against the power of the water technique for a good minute, before he managed to attach the rebreather to his face and took in a grateful gasp of air. The water was freezing and it surrounded him, but it was slowly receding as the chakra that fueled it began to dissipate. The water level fell until it was all gone, leaving Naruto to stand on top of a soggy, muddy wasteland with nothing except the piles of mangled remains of trees. Yagura approached him, looking faintly annoyed. He opened his mouth to speak, but Naruto wasn't giving him a chance. The chakra around him bubbled and hissed, and with a flash of movement, Naruto was lunging at the man again. He bowled over the 3 Tide operatives close to him, and let out a giant billowing cloud of demonic chakra-empowered fire. Yagura swiped at it with his staff, the hook at the end glowing as it ripped the fire apart like it was a piece of paper. "My turn, now," Yagura intoned. A hazy, azure chakra bubbled up around him, and a horrible, sickly sensation settled down upon the area. Many of the Tide operatives stepped back or retreated to a safe distance as their leader brought forward a cloak of chakra similar to Naruto's. Yagura's was of a different hue, but a single bubbling tail swished behind him. Naruto darted back, but then Yagura was dashing forward and he struck Naruto once in the stomach. Something let out a cracking noise and suddenly there was a dull gray substance crawling all over him. The smell of salt and seawater filled his nostrils as the growth clutched to him, writhing and rolling down to his legs and up to his arms until his movements were impaired. Naruto tried to retreat but found it difficult, even with the chakra miasma around him. He was breathing harshly as he tried to break free from the bizarre technique. "Konoha's Jinchuriki, you are now my prisoner, Yagura." The chakra surrounding him bubbled away ominously, and he didn't even look winded despite a series of burns on the edge of his green cloak. Naruto let go of the chakra of the nine-tailed demon fox and immediately sagged against his restraints as a sudden wave of exhaustion and fatigue shook him. He had pushed his body past the natural limits, and now the aftereffects were coming through. Still, despite his bindings, Yagura had done exactly what he wanted him to. Naruto closed his eyes and went limp, giving off an impression of misery and defeat to the enemy. At the same time, he reached deep within himself, close to the seal of the demon fox, but past it. Instead, he reached into the deep, dark pit that existed within his mind. The gluttonous chain, having snacked on the chakra of the demon fox, leapt eagerly to his command. With a sudden inhale of breath, Naruto opened his eyes and chains shot out from his body, bursting from his tenketsu. They were a physical manifestation of the darkest parts of his psyche, and their emergence mangled his flesh and sent blood dripping to the ground. The chains were rusty and corroded, several of the links looking seemingly fragile and broken. They let out a terrible clanking noise that resounded in the skulls of everybody around them, almost like they were letting out a roar of their own, and then they leapt eagerly towards Yagura. The fourth Mizukage was struck before he could react, the chains binding around him eagerly. They coiled and wreathed against him like snakes as he stood a staggered step back. Less than a second later, 5 Tide operatives lunged at Naruto with the intent to kill. But Yagura had either lost his grasp on the binding technique or it had been weakened with the emergence of the chains, because Naruto broke free from his bindings and managed to avoid a fatal blow. One sword scraped against his arm while another clipped the side of his armor, scraping against the ceramic plates inside. As he rolled away, his hands formed in a single hand seal. Detonate. A series of explosive tags, dropped as Naruto had charged at Yagura, exploded in a wave of concussive force. The ground rocked as the Grade 1 tags tore through the dirt. One of the Tide operatives was enveloped and disappeared, standing directly over a tag. Another 2 members went down as they were bombarded by a rain of debris sharper than and as deadly as a hail of kunai. Yagura was thrown off his feet, still struggling against the chains, while Naruto used the momentum of the explosion to roll away. Triumph flared in his mind at his successful ploy as he brought his hands together for another technique. Arise, Titan. The ground shuddered and rumbled again as a mountain of rock and fire tore its way free from the earth. 2 large hands emerged first, covered in thick, oozing tar with veins of fire. Then came the upper chest, reinforced with slabs of thick granite that dripped with molten rock. Finally, a head emerged, a human skull made of stone with a leering, frozen smile of razor-sharp teeth and 2 eye sockets filled with flame. Its legs were submerged in the earth and it remained immobile, but it loomed up into the sky as large as a Class 4 summon, higher than most buildings. It blotted out the sun similar to how Yagura's water technique had done so. Naruto stood on the head of it, and with a furious roar, the construct raised a hand and brought it down. The earth shuddered once more from the impact of the blow and a giant plume of dust and dirt shot up into the air as the blow left a crater bigger than most houses in the scorched dirt. The remains of one of the Tide operatives would be somewhere down there, mangled and splattered beyond recognition. Yagura had recovered, avoiding the blow by jumping back, and he was wrenching the chains away from his body. Many remnants clung to his body like slugs to a wall, but he ignored them as he glared up at Naruto. Whatever demonic chakra he had been using was gone, and Naruto was sure that it wouldn't be returning, especially with those chain fragments on him. Yagura looked furious now, and there was no more talk as he brought his hands together. Naruto brought the Titan's arm back up to deliver another devastating blow at the Mizukage. As the house-size fist came down, Yagura brandished his hands together and a column of spiraling water exploded forward to meet it. The sheer power of the technique sent the Titan staggering back and water turned to steam as it met the fiery hand. But, the water technique was strong and the granite fingers began to crack as the fires were quenched. Naruto kept the fist up blocking the technique as he made a series of hand seals. He layered his chakra 3 times and winced as an aching burn flashed over his tired body. Earth release, rising stone spears. Earth release, rising stone spears. Earth release, seismic upheaval. Spears of rock burst out of the ground around Yagura, intent on spearing him, and the Mizukage aborted his technique. He batted 4 of them away with his staff and retreated as the spikes continued to emerge from the ground, shooting out as fast as a thrust of the spear. There were dozens of them, hundreds even. At the same time, several parts of the desolate, battered ground burst apart like more explosive tags were going off, shooting debris and tiny bits of dirt and stone all around them. Yagura shielded his face with his cloak as he leapt back, gaining some distance on Naruto and his Titan summon, and when he landed his hands were twisted in the ox seal. Giant geysers of water exploded all around Naruto, giant twisting columns of water on all sides. Naruto gritted his teeth as the water began to crash down upon him, 4 giant waves from every direction coming together to meet him in the center. Earth release, underground excavation. His feet sank into the Earth Titan and he dove down up to his knee, anchoring himself in the construct even as he adjusted his rebreather. The water crashed down on the Titan with tremendous force and the mighty summon staggered on spot. Naruto made several hand seals again and layered his chakra twice, ignoring the agony that spread through his taxed body. Wind release, great wind breakthrough. Wind release, great wind breakthrough. He brandished each of his palms out in different directions just as the churning, raging water came down crashing on the Titan's head. Huge gusts of wind blew out, meeting the water and holding it back for an instant, a barrier of wind against the force of a tsunami. Then the wind technique began to fail as water seeped through, dripping down on Naruto and the Titan's skull. But it had done its job, countering much of the force of the water technique, and when the water came crashing down on Naruto it was with the force of similar to pouring a bucket on his head and not a force that would crush him flat against the rock. The water had enveloped the entire Titan, and Naruto could barely see through it. He was surrounded by it, the freezing liquid pressing against him warmed only by the steam that boiled as it struck the fiery lava of the Titan. He could see, however, that it was not receding, and it spiraled around in a never-ending sphere of motion. He looked down, breathing deeply through the rebreather. Yagura stood at the edge of the giant dome of water, one hand placed within it. The Mizukage stared up at him and a pulse of his chakra shot through the water. Suddenly, the pressure surrounding him increased and Naruto grimaced. He tried to move his arms, but they were slow and sluggish as the pressure continued to increase and increase. His armor creaked and he could feel the strain in his bones. Finally, he brought his hands together in the ram seal and counted the pressure with his own chakra. Almost immediately, the pressure around him subdued as Naruto lashed out with his own raw power, forming a sphere around him to keep the crushing weight off of him. He gritted his teeth as he felt the pressure beginning to return, Yagura intensifying his efforts. Below him, the Titan creaked and groaned. Large cracks and splits appeared in its carapace, the pressure tearing through the granite armor. The cracks were relatively shallow, but they were widening and beginning to get worse. Naruto tried to extend his chakra down on his construct, but the pressure surrounding him became intense and he relented, focusing on protecting only himself. The blonde Jinchuriki glanced down at Yagura, hoping to see some kind of strain. Instead, Yagura had placed his other hand in the water and was focusing on something. To Naruto's disbelief, water rippled around each of his fingertips and 5 sharks of water formed. They swished their tails as they began to swim towards Naruto, intent on devouring him and tearing him to shreds. Naruto, his hand clasped in a ram seal, desperately tried to think of a solution to Yagura's latest attack. His mind racing, he began lowering himself deeper and deeper into the head of the Titan. It was hard keeping the pressure from instantly killing him while trying to deepen the underground excavation technique. The sharks swam closer and closer, darting through the water at incredible speeds as Naruto sank deeper and deeper into the Titan's head. Just as his head was submerging, one of the sharks was close enough to lunge at him. The last thing he saw before his head dipped beneath the surface of the rock was the shark's mouth mere centimeters away from his head. Then everything was dark and something thudded heavily above him. The crushing pressure around him was gone, shielded by the thick granite of the Titan, but it was continuing to weaken and groan as the pressure began to tear it apart. Naruto kept his hands in the ram seal, but refocused his chakra throughout the Titan. He used the underground excavation technique to keep moving through it even as he began to direct the Titan to move. The stone and rock around him was shattering and shuddering as he climbed upwards, traveling through the arm that was slowly but surely fighting against the pressure and rising up through the moving arm. Finally, he felt the Titan push through the thick, unyielding water and he burst out from the rock on the hand of the Titan, held above its head and over the dome of spiraling water. Water dripped from his head as he looked down on the massive spiraling dome of water below him, his eyes wide. It was a devastatingly powerful technique, one that could end entire platoons of shinobi. The water below him rippled, and then suddenly something was lunging at him. Naruto stepped back reflexively as a water shark burst out of the water, its jaws snapping towards him, and it was only the fact that he slipped on the rock that saved his life. Naruto fell from the fingers and back towards the dome of water as the shark soared over him, but he flipped in midair and desperately channeled chakra to his feet. When he landed on the dome of water, he managed to keep himself on top even as he began sliding down the edge and towards the ground. Sharks leapt out of the water, snapping jaws and gnashing teeth trying to end his life, but Naruto avoided them with a mixture of water walking and just falling, his chakra struggling to stick to Yagura's water. He fell towards the ground, righted himself and managed to stick to the edge of the gigantic dome of water before slipping once more. The water beneath his feet, however, was beginning to recede. No, it was moving inwards, forced in by Yagura's technique, and Naruto abruptly lost his footing and fell helplessly to the ground. He spun in the air, whipping around just as the water shattered his titan's armor. A tremendous boom roared through the air so loud that Naruto's hearing temporarily left him. A high-pitched whine filled his head as the titan exploded in a shower of water and rock, the water dome destabilizing and exploding outwards with tremendous force. The force of the pressure and the explosion sent the rocky debris and water flying for kilometer. Something flashed at him and Naruto grunted as a piece of rock struck him in the chest. He was sent flipping wildly through the air as the force of the explosion pushed him backwards to a 30-story fall with nowhere but the cratered, muddied and scorched ground to land. He still couldn't hear anything as he hurtled toward the ground. His body hurt all over. His chakra was exhausted. Blood dripped from his ears and nose. Naruto desperately reached within him, seeking the power of the nine-tailed demon fox, seeking something that could save him. Rattling chains filled his mind, the only thing he could hear as they eagerly latched onto him, and he struggled against the grip as he sought out the demon fox. A single tendril of crimson power lanced through him and Naruto took it eagerly, using it to envelope himself in a crimson miasma of power just as he struck the ground with enough force to shatter boulders. The chakra shroud bore the brunt of the impact, and it was the only thing that saved his life. He went sliding and rolling along the ground. His armor cracked, one of his arms snapped the wrong way and his mask shattered, falling off his face as he rolled along the ground, hitting debris, rocks and anything else in his way. A particularly strong blow to the head left him dizzy, but his hearing returned, continuing to skid and tumble along until he finally came to a stop. He lay on his back, staring up at the sky, his entire body aching and his mind just stunned. Water fell down on his face, dripping softly as the last of the water dome technique fell from the sky. It was almost like rain, and the sun beamed down on him from, thawing a bit of the freezing sensation that had surrounded him. Naruto let out a pained, gurgling rattle and rolled over. He was panting, each breath coming out in a labored wheeze, his eyes struggling to focus, and it hurt to move. Nonetheless, he stood up, exhausted, wet and wounded, and gingerly cradled his arm as he turned, looking for Yagura. The fourth Mizukage was coming, walking with a limp as blood trickled down his temple. Clearly, he hadn't been expecting the explosive reaction from the Titan either, but he seemed to be in better shape than Naruto. He held the remnants of his staff, a single piece of broken steel, and one of his eyes was closed over, bruised and bloody. His face was set in stone, and there was a pressure in the air that Naruto just couldn't match. But then he didn't need to. Yagura paused in his advance, his eyes widening with shock as a shadow loomed behind Naruto. The Anbu turned his head to see Terumi May standing behind him. Her wavy crimson hair swayed behind her as she placed a warm hand on Naruto's shoulder, smiling gently at him. "Thank you, Naruto," she told him quietly. "You did well." A man with an eye patch stood behind her. He gave Naruto a considering look but kept his attention on Yagura, who had swiveled around to check around him. He was surrounded. A woman wielding two swords crackling with lightning stood with a large, bare-chested man holding a gigantic sword over his shoulder. A boy no older than 18 dressed in loose flowing robes puffed on a pipe that was letting out bubbles, standing next to somebody wearing the mask of a hunter nin. Chukichi, one of the resistance members Naruto had met earlier, stood beyond them with several others, each man and women looking grim. Finally, Mei stood in front of Naruto, radiating a deadly calm. There was no teasing smile on her face, no jokes, and after reassuring Naruto she had stepped forward. "Yagura." Her voice boomed out over the cratered, devastated battlefield. "You're tired, injured and outnumbered. Surrender, or we will put you down." Yagura looked annoyed. "Terumi May," he acknowledged stiffly. "What are you doing here?" May smiled chillingly. I'm here to end your reign as Mizukage, she replied. This is the day of revolution, Yagura. Our forces are on the homelands overthrowing your forces as we speak. Loyal shinobi are subduing your forces and retaking control of our country. Today, Yagura, we announce that we are free. Yagura stared at her. Bait, he said quietly. He smiled a tad ruefully. Konoha was bait. I knew you wouldn't let it go unanswered, Mei answered. She folded her arms over her flak vest. You're far away from your forces, Yagura, and your empire is crumbling. Will you submit? Don't you dare trample on my dream. Yagura snarled. He threw away the broken end of his staff, his eyes wild. I will end you today, woman, and crush your pathetic rebellion. Mei didn't look back at Naruto, but her next words were directed towards him. It's time to leave, Uzumaki Naruto, she told him gently. This is Kiri business, and you've done enough to help. She slapped her hands together as Yagura did the same, and the resistance forces around him tensed and readied themselves for battle. Leave the rest to us. Naruto, breathing deeply and with a wheeze, took a single last look at the scene. Despite his strength, Yagura was clearly not at his best, and Mei herself had been able to match him before. With the others, there was little chance that the tyrannical man was going to get away. He was standing on the graveyard of the fourth Mizukage. He turned and didn't look back as he fled from the scene, even when the sound of battle began to rage behind him. That will be it for this video. If you want more, comment down below, like, subscribe. And see you guys later.